The natural
It's
water.
funny, I'm just looking at the color.
Yeah, we're
Look
the
at the
same
difference in
couple,
color,
okay.
because everybody's sort of dark on this side, and everybody's very
Right.
colorful. Yeah.
Greens and browns.
We're
Isn't
pastel.
that funny?
It harkens back to a better age when there were men's clubs in New York City that excluded women.
Did you litigate
I just wanna
against
know-
that?
Yeah, but you know, that doesn't mean you can't like it.
The cigars.
Or be nostalgic for what was good about it.
Well, do you think you notice one another more if you're seating this way?
Absolutely.
Mainly because you're
I
physically
think the
facing
view is
them.
better.
Yeah.
The view is better.
View is
Yes.
better.
Yeah.
You don't have to go, ooh.
You're not sitting with your couple, so you're more community.
You're more community. Oh, that's an interesting thought too. So we'll start again with David. Where are you, David? There you are.
Hiding in the
Fearless
middle
leader.
Thank you, everybody, again. For those who weren't with us last time, I've got to thank Ruth and Jerry so much for helping put together this series of discussions. And the purpose really is to bring additional support to the museum, for the museum to bring a community together at the time of year that there isn't a whole lot going on. Although I must say the difference in weather between last time and this time is pretty marked. I think the snow was up to our knees trying to get into Stephanie and Peter's house.
It was.
And so just to review real quickly our talk last time on spiritualism, it was, I think, a really interesting topic, and I think like all of these, the topic is so huge, we couldn't really contain it within the hour or two that we had, and that topic spills over into all the others, as I think the one today will spill over into all the others. But I was working on something else recently, and what came to me in looking at these readings and some other things I'm doing is just the power that the history of the Shakers has to just continually astonish me personally. I don't know about you guys when you were reading this stuff, but part of it is because they were so odd compared to the majority population. Part of it is because they were so committed to each other and their experiment. Part of it is just how successful they were and how quickly. You know, within only 20, 30 years, they had this defined aesthetic and a defined sense of values that led to all of the things that we're talking about today. So spiritualism, just to recap what we did last time, we were meeting at Stephanie and Peter's unbelievable historic house in New Lebanon, the Gilbert House, and Jerry brought along information that showed that Mr. Gilbert, in fact, went up and visited the Shakers. So there was a sort of human connection between the space and Mount Lebanon. And we met in the spectacularly odd room on their third floor, which had been a Masonic temple from
1795.
1795. So beautiful, and it was a haunting day. The light coming in, and the two fireplaces going, and it was really a beautiful day, and certainly one that I'll not forget. So thank you, first of all, to Peter and Stephanie. Spiritualism, the topic being basically what happens to all of us after we die, and is there the division between life and something after life in which that barrier can be crossed? Can we communicate with people on the other side? And the Shakers, early on, believed that souls of the departed continued to be part of their community, that they were around, and they could be accessed. Later on, what are the Fox sisters, right, in Western New York? Two young women started hearing rappings, and the whole 19th century movement of spiritualism sort of got its start. But we were able to find in our readings that the Shakers supported the Fox sisters, were interested in what they were doing, continued to be interested in spiritualism, and we talked about sort of the movement throughout the 19th century, and a lot we didn't talk about. Things like Mary Baker Eddy, for example, who was buried with a telephone, right? We didn't quite get to all of that, but certainly the ideas of spiritualism had vast impact on the thinking of the 19th century. We then took a slight detour and talked about Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote a book on spiritualism, the writer of the Sherlock Holmes books, and became completely immersed in the topic, and ended up debating, according to Ruth, right, in public debates, debated Houdini, who did not believe in spiritualism. So the other thing I was thinking about the Shakers recently is they're sort of the Zelig of the 19th century. No matter what the topic or what's going on, even though sequestered in their little communities. They pop up everywhere in the history of ideas in the 19th century. And of course, this goes right back into the religious revival of this area. New Lebanon was a huge tent revival place. Before it was a town, it was the little edge of Calvinist Massachusetts, where people came over, and there was a famous spring, and there were preachers preaching fire and brimstone. And in fact, that was the beginning of the Shakers in America. Ann Lee and her little band came over from Albany, began preaching, began getting converts, and then spread throughout New England. So we connected it right back to New Lebanon. And then we had a few ideas about contemporary spiritualism, the most interesting one, I think, being the Sufis at Mount Lebanon, sending us their thoughts on how they viewed spiritualism. And what I liked particularly about that was their practice of trying to practice dying before dying. And that was part of their idea of spiritualism, was trying to get into the space of being on the other side. So that's a quick, I think, summary. For those who are interested in spending a long time on what we did last time, as we are today, we videoed the last meeting, and we'll put, as we did last time, we'll put this one up on YouTube, so feel free to see it.
Thanks, David. And there is a spiritualist church in Albany. I did attend, and we talked about last time, Herb and my experience with the spiritualist church in New York City. And I've checked with the ministers in Albany, and they would welcome a group to come and participate in a seance. So anyone who's interested, let me know, and I will organize that if you are. All right, let's move it now to Jerry Grant, who's going to give us a bit of a... We're going to step back for a minute, because we just dived into spiritualism without really pausing and saying, well, who were the Shakers? So let's get that focused on first.
Great. I think both Ruth and I felt like, I think I put it that we sort of started this whole thing, the series of 5 programs, with 2 programs that really force you to suspend, well, not to suspend, but to accept the fact that the Shakers, accept some of the core beliefs of the Shakers before you really knew much about them. And so we jumped right into things like communication with the spirit world, and this week with issues of celibacy and a different form of marriage or non-marriage and living in community, which become sort of core beliefs based on communication and revelation, and not necessarily just the logic of day-to-day living. I think the next 3 programs that we're doing are more an application of Shaker practice, in that we're going to look at pacifism and life in community and diet. And I think the diet one, food thing, we ought to couch in terms of Shaker concern for health and taking care of the body, and in terms of diet and medical care and how diet affects medical care. So these are very practical issues. What Ruth asked me to do today was just some thoughts about, mostly about early Shakerism, and try to set a stage for how the whole issue about sex, marriage, celibacy came to the group. And I had the thing that kept going through my head in the last couple of days was Leonard Cohen wrote a song called The Story of Isaac, which is the story about Abraham taking Isaac up the mountains with his axe to sacrifice him. And of course, either Judy Collins or somebody sang the song much nicer than he did, but they left out the last verse. And the last verse is a piece that really, I'm not singing because it got on tape last time. but the last verse has a line that, where he says, basically, you who have sacrificed our children, you got to stop doing it. And he said, don't get confused. A scheme is not a vision. And that phrase, a scheme is not a vision, sticks with me with the Shakers. And oftentimes when I'm in a position to talk about the Shakers with people, and I talk about their early history, I get back from people, this isn't a vision, this is a scheme. You know, Ann Lee, the Shakers, the early believers, they just made this thing up. They constructed this thing for their own convenience, their own benefit. And I think we had some of that in the talk about spiritualism. John and I were talking about, John Broom and I were talking about the difference between why would somebody decide they wanted to talk to the dead. You know, there had to be a reason, either psychological or serving some kind of need. And I'm saying but what happens when the dead just come to you and you're not looking for it. So I think that's the difference between the scheme and the vision. And I think what's important to me, the longer that I read about and get to know the Shakers through their writings and the Shakers that are living, is this is very much something that they're not scheming. You know, there may be some Shakers who schemed, but for the most part, the core of this group is are people who believe that they have real visionary powers and real communications with God, with Christ, with the spirit world in general. So, starting with that, just to set the stage a little bit, back in England, where the Shakers came from, around the town of Manchester, where the Shakers started in the 1730s, 1740s, there's a huge amount of activity having to do with putting personal revelation back in the Church of England. People felt separated, much in the way that Catholics did, between, you know, having to have an intermediary of the priest between them and God. And I think that in England there was a huge number of different little groups that were looking for a desire to have more personal communication with the Spirit. And the group that we best know, and I'm going to go way out on a limb here, but it's a small group, and it is on tape. And in that, I think, you know, the Shakers claim their background to Quakerism, and they make that connection because I think people understood Quakers. They understood some of the basic beliefs, pacifism and revelation were two things that the Shakers could connect with the Quakers. But in fact, the whole group, all these little groups around where the Shakers were all some form of Wesley Methodists. And if you start looking at some of the core beliefs of the Shakers, or certainly some of the practices, they all look like very early Methodists to me. And even down to, I will tell you, this is just a little teaser, and then someday I'll figure this all out enough to actually put it in a better presentation. But the Shakers' official name was the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing. What John Wesley organized in order to get the Methodist churches up and running were things called United Societies. And that was a core group of people that really were strong believers and had some of the new light that he was trying to get to people. And so I think what the Shakers are is maybe they are the United Society. In addition, they believe that Christ had come again. And so I think what they are is they're maybe a radical fringe group of Methodists who found their way and connected up to a single charismatic leader. Enters Ann Lee in the late 1830s. And she is somebody who has a background typical of a lot of young women at that time, raised in a family in a working class town where morals were not the best. One writer said, if you were 14, a woman 14 years old around Manchester, you were not a virgin. And so that was the sort of setting that, you know, he put her into. I'm not sure how accurate his assessment is, but
You said 1830. What did you mean?
I mean 1730. Sorry.
Jerry often speaks of the present day and says,
Yeah.
1850.
I date checks 1830.
I heard it was the same thing in 1930.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh,
Right.
how are the morals?
Yeah. I should know that. But and Anne, you know, Anne is somebody who was married to her father was a blacksmith. She married a blacksmith who had worked with her father, and he apparently was not the kindest husband. Not, you know, terrible, but not the kindest husband. And he fathered four children, all of whom died young.
Instead of she mothered.
And she mothered, he fathered, mothered. They produced. And there's just a period when she's connected to the society, and at the same time having children die. People always make this into, this is where Shakerism comes from, sort of the disappointment, the tragedy of childbirth and infants dying. But she's also having, you know, these revelations.